Conscient Podcast, episode 205. Multidisciplinary artist and equity advisor Sheila James.
In the face of destruction, we should create. In the face of hurt, we should heal. Right? In the face of hate, we should love. So that's my feeling. And figuring out how to do that is, everybody's job.
Yes, it's everybody's job. I've known Sheila for 25 years as a arts funder colleague. Her work as an artist, film, literature, but also her work as an equity expert, social activist, and a family friend. Now, our conversation began with an overview of her views on equity and how it differs from equality. For example,
equity is actually acknowledging that and saying for some people who are disadvantaged, you need to do more. You can't just say everything's fair, everybody gets the same, bowl of pudding. You say something like, well, everything's not fair. So for this person, they're going to get more pudding, or they're going to get pudding that's gluten-free, or whatever it is. It's about making accommodations or making adaptations so that people have that comparable quality of life.
We also touched upon equity in the arts, such as some of the biases and systemic injustices that exist within cultural institutions. We also talked about the historical context of arts funding in Canada, notably some of the missed opportunities for support of Indigenous and diverse cultural practices. We also talked about Sheila's multidisciplinary art, including in this case her writing. And I clearly recall reading one of her short stories from In the Wake of Loss called The Arrangement. And I was at the cottage and feeling a deep connection with her engaging stories as I walked in the forest. I asked Sheila to talk about her new novel, Outcast, published by Goose Lane Editions, which was launched on May 7th of this year, 2024. And it explores caste and class complexities in Hyderabad during India's independence, highlighting a communist rebellion, caste dynamics, and land reform. I was pleased that Sheila accepted to read 2 excerpts from the novel that bring to life the struggles and resilience of her characters. The first you'll hear is set in 1948 in Korampally, India, and is about the character Malika, a Muslim peasant, imparting her hopes for her daughter amidst rebellion. And shortly after this excerpt, you'll hear music by Sheila, a song called You Will Have Worth. Later in our conversation, in fact at the end, the second excerpt is one set in 1997 in Toronto, and is about Anya, who is visiting her grandfather, Irwin, at the Queen Street Mental Health Centre. And this section is reflecting on family bonds and emotional support in grief. Again, it will be followed by a song by Sheila, Through the Eyes. And as we spoke about her book and literature more generally, Sheila emphasized the importance of empathy when engaging with characters in the book. And I really like the way she encourages readers to find compassion even for the most detestable characters, as this can foster understanding and potential for redemption. For example,
I would just hope that if people are picking up the book, that they're very open-minded and try to read the characters or listen to the characters where they're at. There are some horrendous sort of characters. Some people, I should say, there are some people who do some horrendous things in this book.
our conversation concluded around the notion of the responsibility of artists in today's complex world, emphasizing the importance of listening, questioning, and dreaming.
I love the idea of listening, and really taking that time to listen, because I don't think we do that enough. And that means listening not only to the things we want to hear, but the sides that we don't want to hear.
Sheila James, welcome to the Conscience Podcast.
Thank you so much, Claude.
Now, we've known each other for a long time, probably 25 years. I remember when I first started at Canada Council, your name, Sheila James, was on my list of prospective jurors. Really good, multi-interdisciplinary artist. She does it all, And then shortly after, you became a colleague of mine at the council. And we've done a lot of things together. You ran the equity office at Canada Council, and I was running InterArts, and we did a lot of collaborations and exchanges and ideas. And one of the things I admire about you is that you did your work really well, and you continued to be an artist. You continued to produce films and, writing. I remember reading some of your short stories at the cottage that I really loved, and now you have this new novel. And we're going to talk about all of these things in your life and your thoughts on arts and the ecological crisis. But with the equity lens it being, I think, important to always think about where some of the root causes of the situations that we got into. But yeah, let's start at the beginning and have you introduce yourself, where you're from, some of your influences, and then we'll jump into a conversation about your art and your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and that sounds good. I'm Sheila James. I use pronouns she and her. And who am I? I'm an immigrant. I'm from South Asian background. So my parents hail from Hyderabad and India, which is South Central India. And I've lived in Canada most of my life, and I'm an artist, as you mentioned, multidisciplinary theater, music, video, media arts, writing, right? And I'm here with my new book, Outcast. It was published by Goose Lane Editions. And so I've been working in the arts for many, many years as an artist, but also as an arts administrator at the Canada Council for the Arts. But I also had my own consulting company where I was doing equity work for a number of cultural organizations. And now I'm actually working at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. So always trying to forward that notion of equity, diversity, access, and social justice.
And doing it through your art as well as through your work as a policy person, as an advisor, as a conflict resolution solver. There's all these things that one can do and must do. Just a really basic question. When you talk about equity, what does it mean to you? Because it's such a broad term, when you use the term, what do you mean?
I like to talk about equity in terms of a framework of equality. Some people don't like to use the word equality very much anymore, but that's really what it is. We want to be equal with each other. We want to have lives that are worth living, that are comparably satisfying, right? And so, I go back to, there's formal equality, which means no people should be discriminated against, right? People should have access to resources. And equity is what we call substantive equality. And that's really where we recognize that people don't have similar or the same starting places. So people come into this world, some with advantages, some with disadvantages. And so equity is actually acknowledging that and saying, for some people who are disadvantaged, you need to do more. You can't just say everything's fair, everybody gets the same, bowl of pudding. You say something like, well, everything's not fair. So for this person, they're going to get more pudding, or they're going to get pudding that's gluten-free, or whatever it is. It's about making accommodations or making adaptations so that people have that comparable quality of life. And then I go to like full equality, is where the conditions around us, right? Our environments, our structures, our systems are so just that people have that quality of life that they want. And, we talk about, the notion of universal design, where the environment is created that anybody, regardless of size, shape, language, religion, can find themselves in that environment. And that's what I call full equality. Equity is in between. It's sort of those stepping stones towards that full equality.
I remember talking with Jimmy Ung in Montreal about privilege, and that's one form of, I guess it's a privilege to be able to talk about privilege. His philosophy, I think, was to kind of be in context, to position yourself in a place and to realize what you have and what others don't have, and to then therefore be aware and act as in relation to.
Yeah, and that's kind of the advantage and disadvantage, right? And that's knowing what the context, the starting points, like where are we? What do we come into this world with? And then what do we make of it, right? So, yeah, there's always context when we talk about equality and equity. Yeah.
Now, equity in the arts, which you've worked a lot on, is probably complicated because the arts are so open-ended, right? It's a form of expression, and yet if you are trying to make it a level playing field for all, there's all kinds of biases and structures, institutions like Canada Council where we work, where there's notions of excellence and all these things that we need to deal with if we're going to have fair assessment and fair access. So what are some of the issues that we face in equity in the arts?
Oh my goodness, that's a
big question. I know.
That's a thesis.
I said some.
Yeah. So, well, this notion that the arts are about creativity, that's the very basic seed. But different people's creativity and different forms of creativity are given different value. They're given different investment. They're given a different affirmation, depending on the societies, right? And so in Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts was modeled after the British system, right? And so it inherited, the classical Western art forms as the mainstays of our society. And I think it's so interesting, right? Because Canada is, of course, created on Indigenous lands, and at the expense of Indigenous people, so the expense of their lives, their cultures, their worldviews, their labor. And I think, when the Canada Council was created, 1957, a lot of Indigenous art, culture was criminalized. It was banned. And what would Canada Council have looked like? What would Canadian culture look like if the thinkers, the creators, the Massey Commission, for instance, started with, well, what's here, right? What is the art and the culture coming out of this land? What is the art and culture coming from afar, in terms of the colonial settler population? And what are the other cultures coming in, as part of migration and immigration and so on? So, there was a missed opportunity there, because wouldn't it have looked different if at the heart of it, we started funding the Indigenous art and culture, right? That was, of course, Indigenous
funding it, or at least stopping it.
Well, ceasing to stop it, but
That's
also
right.
to support it, to nurture it. Now, of course, we've come, to this place, I think, where Indigenous arts is really important. And there is a revitalization, there's more funding, there's more recognition. And the artists are doing amazing things. And of course, I think that's as it should be. But I think it's interesting to look back and say, what if? What would have happened? What would have been different? And I think what would have been different are the institutions. I don't think we would have had the same kind of institutions that we have now. And the same, I'm going to say, tracks of how to become an artist. Mm-hmm. There would have been different ways to become an artist. Also, in terms of the other non-European arts that are part of our wonderful country, whether they're art forms from places in Africa or places in Asia or South America, I think those would have flourished differently too, with a different base, right? If the base was Indigenous, it would have been in relationship to that. And I think that's an interesting piece to think of as well, right? We're not there yet, because there's been a lot of investment. And I think that notion of decolonizing the arts is it's a big, complex issue. And, there's different trains of thought with whether, that's what people want to do, right? And what does that mean? I think, equity in the art, making things fairer, giving access to people, access to persons with disabilities, deaf artists, that is still a little bit 101, right? It's getting better, of course, with digital arts, opening up access to people who are blind, who are deaf, and so on. But certainly the live arts, I think we need to do better, in terms of just accessibility as well. So,
well, the connecting all the dots of inequities and injustices, there's climate justice where climate change is happening more in certain communities of color, or communities of disenfranchised in terms of infrastructure. And so I've been thinking about that and connecting those dots. And my immediate concern is art and the ecological crisis, not in an instrumentalized kind of way, but what artists are doing. And we'll get to your book now, because it's a really good example. I haven't read it all. I started reading it, and I have a little excerpt I want to read, or a little thing I want to read, but maybe I'll get you to read some of it so people get a flavor of it. That'll be nice. But let's use it as an example of why you're writing. Like, what is it about? And I know it addresses inequities and it's a story. It's a big novel. But I want to see how we can think through your book about other issues and why you did what you did. So maybe start at the beginning and what is the book? What is it about? Because it's a really nice opportunity to talk to the author.
Yeah, well, and as you said, everything's connected and everything's in context, right? So while it's not directly related to, the climate crisis or ecology, it's all related, because it has to do with, as we spoke about, privilege, has to do with power, has to do with advantage and disadvantage in terms of human beings. The title is Outcast with an E, and so that relates to the caste system in India, particularly in Hinduism. The impetus for the book came out of a story that my dad told me. So I was in grade 7, and we were in my history class, and everybody was asked to write about their ancestors, and I knew nothing about my ancestors, only that they lived in India. You probably at that time I didn't even know where, or, because we were, like my parents were, living the Canadian dream or the immigrant dream and working hard and raising 4 kids. And so I ran home and I asked my dad, tell me a story about my ancestors. So he went on to tell me the story about how my grandfather opened the gates of Hyderabad to allow the Indian Army to come into the city and quell a rebellion. Now, I basically wrote that story, and I got an A+ or something on my essay. But many years later, in 1994, I go to India, and I find out what that rebellion is. And it was actually a communist rebellion. It was a communist rebellion that involved many, many peasants who worked and toiled the land they were fighting against basically the Nizam, or the king of this large country or state. It was called a princely state of Hyderabad. And it was basically a feudal system where they were taxed heavily. There was no human rights. There was something called veti, which was basically bonded labor or slavery. It was slavery, basically, for landless peasants. And many of them were Dalits, or people who were on the lowest subcastes. Many people, use the derogatory term of untouchables, right? And so I also found out in that conversation with my dad that our ancestors, or we, on his side, were Dalits. So we actually came from this caste, or are Dalits, though we converted to Christianity. My grandparents and parents got education, and so moved through the class ladder. But we were untouchables, or Dalits, and we are Dalits. So what that made me think of is, okay, this is very complex. There's this caste system, but then there's class, which is movable, and then there's this history about this communist movement in the middle of India in 1940, between 1946 to about 1952, just at the time when India was becoming independent from the British. So that is the context that we're talking about. We're talking about Hyderabad, the state of Hyderabad, right in the middle, the heart of India, where all the other states around were rebelling against the British and seeking an independent republic. And in the middle, the Nizam of Hyderabad did not want to join the Union. And so then the Indian army, once it became independent, came in and crushed Hyderabad and took over. So that's what the story, that's the context of the history. But underneath it are all these questions about caste, the treatment of people who are Dalits, the treatment of women, the notion of like what drives somebody to actually rebel, to take up arms, what drives people to do that. And I think there is a really interesting, when we talk about land is big in this book, because whose land is it? Who gets to own land? Who gets to control land? Who gets to control the products from the land? Who does it feed? How is it used, right? And then at some point in this book, the main characters go to Canada, and then whose land is that, right? So land is big, family is big, history is big, conflict is big, and all of these things, of course, resonate in so many ways today in current conflicts that we're seeing. So I don't know if that gives you an idea. It doesn't. I haven't mentioned any of the characters yet, but that's a piece of it.
And Sheila, why don't we hear a couple of excerpts from your book now?
Okay. So this is an excerpt that is focusing on Malika. And Malika is a Muslim peasant who is part of the communist movement. And she's been working in this rebellion for some time. So this brings her back to her village of Korampally. Squad members pointed the flames of their torches into the mouth of the well. Malika fixed her gaze on the one thing that moved. Jaya's tiny arms were flailing about on either side of a body collapsed upon her. It was Vijay. His back was riddled with bullets, and underneath his corpse, Jaya was struggling to free herself. Chinni Jaya, little victory. A comrade moved Malika aside. He had already tied a rope around his waist. Others worked the pulley, lowering him deeper and deeper. Malika stood silent and still as they drew first the inert body of her husband from the well, and then her daughter. 15 people below Jaya would be pulled up in turn, but no others were alive. The blood on Jaya was her father's. Miraculously, the little girl was uninjured. Malika's comrades repeated this fact to her like a mantra. She is alive! She is alive! Malika held her child, tried to speak with her, comfort her. But Jaya, who had stopped crying, could no longer speak. A vacant look in Jaya's eyes told Malika she could not reach her daughter. Even with her children and comrades nearby, Malika felt utterly alone. The new squad found the Reddy compound empty. Where were their comrades, the ones who should have been governing Korampali? A villager on the street said they had all left for Mahbub Nagar. The place was deserted. The comrades distributed food and then found a place to sleep. Malika discovered a room with a bed, wardrobe, and water vessel, an unimaginable luxury for her and her children. She put her baby to sleep. Then she turned to Jaya. Jaya sat unmoving on the bed, except for her eyes, which darted around the room, as if she were searching for someone. Malika folded Jaya into her bosom and let her drink from her breasts. Then Malika spoke the words she hoped her daughter would understand. Jaya, you will see. You have a place on this earth, neither servant nor slave. You will have food in your belly and land beneath your feet. But more than riches, more than beauty, more than intelligence, you will have worth. It was all she could hope for.
You will have worth.
Part that caught my attention in your author's note, which is at the end of the book. I'm reading the electronic version. People can have the electronic or the paper version. I'll just read it to you. I'm trying to make meaning from these complex histories and oppressive social structures. It is an attempt to recognize the inherent value of the lives of those, like many of us, who search for a sense of worth and justice. That's more or less what you just described, right? But it hit me that that's what the ecological crisis is, essentially. It's this sense that we've exploited, I guess, each other in ways that are, and not just humans, we've exploited the land and our not more than human kin in ways that have, especially with capitalism, that was added on, and the I've been reading about Christianity and the division of nature and man, and how we built these systems that are inherently unjust. They're elitist and including in India, but also in other parts of the world. And so, how do we work our way through this? I guess, and in writing a book, you're bringing us into a story of, it's not your lived experience, but it's related to your family experience. How do you think art in a book like this can help us transform, or at least get to another place, to get through these complexities? How can a book help?
Well, I was struck by what you said about the division between animals and humans. And I think there's something else that this book brings out, which is the divisions between humans, and who is treated humanely and who is not. And I don't know if you know that, in India, with the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, cows would have a greater worth and value, for instance, than a Dalit person.
I've heard that. I actually don't understand it.
Yeah, so if a Dalit or even a Muslim person was caught, killing a cow, or, they could be, a mob might set on them, or they would be killed, and it was somehow justified, right? And then, of course, Christianity did horrible things, right? Like, that's why we see in Christianity a different kind of a caste system. So you can say Indigenous peoples occupied that lowest rung of the caste because there's been several genocides, exploitation. Black slaves were the same thing, that dehumanizing people, right? For gain, for product, for, capital, for control. And so I think what this book does is, if we can look at all of the relationships we have, right? We have a relationship with each other, sitting across, speaking the same language. We have relationships with people whose language we don't speak, but we have, we pass them by, or we try to communicate. We have relationships with animals. We have relationship with food. We have relationship with people, thousands of miles away. But depending on our investments and our, it could be causing harm, right? Depending how we vote, it could be causing harm, and it is. So I like to think of this book as, it is definitely based in India at a historic point. Caste still plays out, especially lately with the Modi government, where they're codifying caste more and more, even though there have been several efforts to criminalize, discrimination based on caste. I mean, it is in the Constitution of India, it is illegal. But also, I want us to think about who is occupying the current subcastes in our society. Are they Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar? Are they Palestinians in Gaza? Are they Sudanese, right? Are they Indigenous people? Are they murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls who are not getting the attention they need, in our political will to stop this, right? Like, so who is modern day caste? Because I think it's too easy for us to look at a book like mine, which is historic fiction, and say, oh, that's so awful, the way they treated the Dalits, which it still continues to be awful, the way Dalits are dehumanized. But it's easy to put these things in kind of a time capsule and think that they're not happening now. But they are, definitely. One way of answering your question.
Yeah, and it's troubling to think, because it's painful for us to think about all of that suffering and inequity. And inequity is not even really the right word, right? Because we struggle for words to describe things that are unbearable, right? And the privilege we have here, the freedom we have to speak, as you said, and to use technology to share our stories, not everyone has that kind of access. So I struggle with my own, privilege as a older white male who was just born in a certain place in a certain time and has had incredible opportunity. And then I think about, what do I do with my time, the time I have left on this planet, and this dying planet, because we are killing it, I'm afraid. And then I think about just dialogue, when you listen. I'm a listener and through my acoustic ecology practice and listening. And when I read a book, I listen to it. In fact, when I can, I actually listen literally to the audio version. But it's like a form of listening to me, engaging with the work of art, listening through your eyes and ears and your experience. And it does go very deeply in touching us and then changing our behavior and making us more able to deal with those complexities. Like, it's so easy to just turn off the news and say, well, actually, I'm fine and I'm not going to deal with this. But I can't not pay attention to Sudan, even though I don't understand it fully. I spend time trying to understand and giving money and doing whatever I can. But for instance, there was an artist, Dawit Seto from Ethiopia, who was on the podcast, and he told me about the Horn of Africa, and I've never been there, and so I just listened to the impact that the climate emergency is having in his region, and what he does as an artist and filmmaker, and so that's a type of contribution to. So I'm wondering, people listening to you and I talk, a lot of artists are doing what they feel is the right thing to do, and they might be dealing with an issue, or they might be, on the front lines of climate protest, and others are much more reflective. So I'd like to know, Sheila, more about what you think artists should be
doing, not specifically, one type of art form or not, but how can artists become more engaged in the issues of the day? They always have, of course. Artists have always been, front lines and risking all kinds of things. But given where we're at in 2024, the complexities that we face, what could artists do differently or more of? I know it's a very open-ended question, but I'm provoking you.
No, and I think it's important. I mean, and it's what should artists do, or what could artists do? What could anyone do, really? But I love the idea of listening, and really taking that time to listen, because I don't think we do that enough. And that means listening not only to the things we want to hear, but the sides that we don't want to hear. Right? I think what's happening right now in a lot of spheres of conflict is that everybody's like polarized. There seems to be a lot of polarization, a lot of shaming. Certainly people need to feel shame if they're committing atrocities and crimes and so on. But I think that it's easy to point fingers and say, do this, do that, or you should do this, or, or get behind one conflict or the other conflict. And I think really it's making those spaces to listen, to re-explore this notion of how did we get here? Like, how do we get to this climate crisis? And I think, we talked about what are some of the underlying problems, and it sometimes comes down to values. So listening to what are my questioning is, we're listening to sides that, and arguments and opinions that are not ours, which is hard because it's hard to tolerate things we don't believe in, but I think it's important to do that and to question, so I think one thing that's been hard is question how we each live, right? And what can we do better? And not everybody's perfect, and we live in a society where we have to heat houses. Long term, it's like scientists working together with artists, with designers, with, people with imagination, and saying, well, what might that look like, in 10 years from now? Do we need to heat a house the same way we're heating it? How might we live? So I think if we say listening, questioning, and dreaming, because I don't believe I'm a hopeful person, even though I wrote a kind of a book that is it's got quite a bit of angst in it. But I'm a hopeful person, and in the face of destruction, we should create. In the face of hurt, we should heal. Right? In the face of hate, we should love. So that's my feeling. And figuring out how to do that is, everybody's job. I'm not one to be able to tell somebody else how to do that, but that's what I would hope for.
Well, that's very moving, because that's what artists try to do, right? Because whether you're writing a play but we get caught, we trip up on our own biases, our unconscious bias, that get in the way of listening and experiencing. And I have a daily qigong practice, which helps me become more embodied and less lost in thoughts and more feeling. And a lot of people do that in their own way. But anyway, I'm happy that you said it that way, because that resonates with me. And I look forward to reading the book and seeing how it resonates, similar to that story. It was a story about a wedding, the short story that I read from your collection.
Called The Arrangement, I think. In the Wake of Loss, the collection of short stories. Yes.
And I just remember being at the cottage and reading the book and talking to you, and saying, Sheila, don't go there. No, oh, what did you do? Oh, what's going to happen to them? And getting so involved in the story and enjoying it and being, a little terrified. And it worked out well. It worked out pretty well. But that's what art does. It just brings you into other experiences. And and I'm talking about it today. This was like 15 years ago. So stories do have a lot of power. And so what stories do you aspire to write that you haven't yet? I'm interested in what's coming up next for you, Sheila.
Well, that's interesting. So, do I say it?
Up to you.
Well,
You
I'm
could
really
allude to it.
I'm interested in the frailty of humans, the fact that we're contradictory, and the fact that sometimes when we try to do good, we end up doing harm. And that's a little bit in this theme, but I want to explore that in a different way. So I'm looking at a story that is bringing in land, ecology, accountability, and should I say I'm exploring something that's set in Nova Scotia, which is where I grew up in Canada, and it may. I don't want to commit too much because it's like, but it may involve big themes like land theft and ecological devastation, as well as personal the choices that people make to cover things up when they think they're doing good for another group of people. That's pretty vague, but I don't really want to say exactly what it is because it's so new.
You don't know yet,
but
it's interesting that direction, which is a kind of an extension of this book, the through line of your writing, I'm sure, and your other creative works. We're going to wrap up soon. Couple of things. One, is there anything that you wanted to say that I haven't asked you about? I mean, I gave you some questions in advance. Is there something that you wanted to add or you haven't said?
I don't think so. I mean, I would just hope that if people are picking up the book, that they're very open-minded, and try to read the characters or listen to the characters where they're at. There are some horrendous sort of characters. Some people, I should say, there are some people who do some horrendous things in this book. But there was a review that somebody gave me, I think on Amazon or something. And what the woman said when she wrote the review is she said that there are likable characters and there are detestable characters, but each character has parts where you can empathize or understand them. And I think that's what I would want people to do, is to read the book, but see if they can find those germs of empathy or compassion for even the worst characters in the book. I think that would be something I would ask readers to do.
What's the value added of that?
What's the value added?
Yeah, of that kind of empathy with difficult characters.
You know what I think it is, and maybe this is my idealistic self coming through. When you can empathize with some part of somebody, there is room for redemption. Like if somebody can empathize with themselves, first of all, around if somebody commits a terrible crime and they find some part of them that is good, that gives you the hope and the room for redemption. And if they can't see it, it's like they're condemned. And I've read a lot about trauma-informed lawyering and trauma-informed ways of working with people who are criminals. And I've read and seen podcasts of people who forgive people who have like killed their spouse or their child, and it's amazing. Like, oh my goodness, how could somebody ever do that, right? How could you forgive somebody who's taken away somebody so important to you, and even in very brutal ways? And I really think that is from that germ of empathy, that germ of understanding humanity and the good parts and the bad parts and everything in between. And it's that journey of healing too. And so, if nothing else, how do we empathize with people? Again, it goes back to that thing I was talking about around, can you listen to a polarized view and you don't have to accept it, and you can still question it and even work against it or work to dismantle it. But it'll be the first place where you'll understand why that person got there and what pain they're in and how to unpack that so they can come around, right? I think something like that.
Mm-hmm. And my last question is always, what are you reading? And I mean, you're busy, full-time job, you have double children and writing, but what do you read and listen to that brings you joy or that you would recommend to others?
Well, I'm reading right now. I'm actually gone back to a book, The In-Between Life of Vikram Lal by Vasanji. And I'm reading that book. And that's interesting because it starts, it's got a great little epilogue at the beginning that just kind of hooks you to move you forward. But joy is always, I find joy, I get my joy from music. Yeah. So listening to all sorts of things, lots of pop music too.
Yeah. And you write music. And now it's interesting to know what people are. One person told me that they listen to pundits. That's their, and I'm kind of like that. I enjoy political discourse, but once in a while I just love a good story that makes me cry, and there's so many ways to experience the arts. I'm just always curious what people have on their bedside, or what like for me there's a podcast I just started listening to called The Great Simplification. And it's just brilliant because it has so many diverse voices coming in, talking about where we're at. And it's neither hope nor despair. It's just reality. This is where we're at. This is some things that we need to deal with. We're going to slow down. We're going to listen to each other, and we're going to talk about a piece of it, just a little piece of it. And when all those pieces start getting connected from art and culture and culinary arts and all these things, and we realize that they're all human activities that have value. They're the hierarchy. I mean, let's get into hierarchy, Sheila. We're supposed to be ending here, but this is a problem I always had at the council, this hierarchy of art forms and hierarchy of professionals who know the best. And of course, some people are maybe more talented or have training than others, but just this whole idea that there's this I guess we're getting back to the kind of caste system of hierarchies, So I guess it just always comes back to that. How can we respect each other? How can we treat each other fairly and with justice and bring that out of our hearts? Because I think the capacity is there, right, for all of us to do it. And we lost our way. Many of us have lost our ways, and empathy and love and openness will hopefully bring us all back.
Yeah. And sometimes it's painful getting there, but it's probably, I'd say, worth it for all of us. Okay, so this excerpt is in Toronto, 1997. Anya sits in the waiting room at 999, the Mental Health Center on Queen Street, Toronto. Erwin is finally let in by an attendant. Her grandfather looks frail. His clothes are too big for him. His head, walnut brown, is bald except for a short white fringe from ear to ear. His cheeks have lost their friendly fullness, but his amber eyes are still bright as ever. Anya waves. Tata! The attendant directs Erwin toward her, but her grandfather is hesitant. He seems afraid. Of course he would be, Anya thinks. She was only 18 when they last saw each other. That crazy day in the apartment when everything changed. Erwin turns away from Anya. It's okay. The attendant places his hand firmly on Erwin's shoulder. Your daughter Jaya is here. No, I'm Anya, his granddaughter. Anya hands the letter to the attendant. She tries to embrace Erwin, but he backs away, gripping the attendant's arm. Anya persists. Don't worry, Tata. I'll be taking you. Is that your only bag? The attendant slowly pries Erwin's fingers off his arm and hands Anya an 8x10 envelope. These are his medical records, medications, and instructions inside. He's fine. He's just nervous about the transition. The attendant returns to his work, leaving Erwin in Anya's care. Erwin is trembling. Anya takes his hand. Jaya? No, silly. I'm Anya. She reverts to her childhood voice and taps out a rhythm on the back of her hand. Dammaro dam, mit Jaya gam, Shobha dunye dam, Hare Krishna, Hare Ram, Hare Krishna, Hare Ram. Don't you remember me? You're Chini Sitafal. Anya uses the nickname he gave her to jolt his memory. You are here? Of course I am. You are alive? Anya realizes he is confused. Yes, Tata, I am very much alive, and I am glad to see you are too. She squeezes his hand. I was scared you were, I showed up at the farmhouse and a stranger answered the door. I nearly fainted. Erwin stares at her, confounded. I'm sorry I wasn't in touch all these years. I was in the States, playing music, different gigs, different groups, different genres. Just traveling around, I guess. Anasuya? Erwin's voice is weak. Anasuya is dead. Anya speaks firmly, and then more gently. She died. Erwin's eyes fill with tears. Anya brings him in for a hug, wrapping her arms around his frail body and releasing him. She picks up his small but densely packed canvas bag, throws it heavily over her shoulder, and guides him outside.
The truth will hit me. All these dreams